Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And let me go ahead with the share. Hopefully you'll get to see it in a moment. Okay, so these various different mitzvot that don't necessarily seem to have a direct correlation one to another, but they all come under this idea of kadoshim, right? Sanctified, significant, right? So again, and also the Hebrew is not that easy in these particular verses. Al techalel et bidcha lahaznota. Do not desecrate or profane your daughter to cause her to be a prostitute. So I'll keep going with the verse and then we can obviously comment. V'lo tizneh haaretz. So here it says the va could mean to cause, right? So that subsequently the land not fall to harlotry in general. So it could be, so besides that, the land should not fall to harlotry. Umal'ah, so that the land be filled, the haaretz, zima, with depravity or obscenity. So again, this idea of moral behavior having a direct influence on nature, and the idea of something called prishut, which is related to the word that we call Pharisees. So the word lisnot means to like go aside, to go astray, as opposed to prishut, which would be to stay away from things that are not appropriate. So the connection, the possible connection, all has to do with subtle practices of idolatry. So let's see what Rashi has to say. He's not obviously necessarily going to be so philosophical, but more in terms of understanding the pshat of the verse, right? Lo techalel et bitcha lahasnota. In other words, don't cause your desecrate or profane your daughter to cause her to become a prostitute. Um, okay, let me keep going to Rashi. The Moser Bito Pnuya, this is talking about a case of someone who turns his unmarried daughter, Levi'ah, Shelo L'Shem Kiddushim, for intercourse that is not for the sake of marriage, that it should be for the sake of marriage. Of course, this is not going to fall well in terms of today's society by and large, but clearly this is one of those examples of where the Torah expects a high level of morality and on the part of those who wish to follow it. Um, Interestingly enough, I was meditating a little bit on this techalel, to desecrate, right? So it's interesting because chilul, right, is the opposite of kadosh. It's the opposite. And I'm wondering if psychologically engaging in this kind of behavior, whether or what it does to a person's sense of being significant. I wonder. So a lot more, of course, that could be discussed from a psychological standpoint. Going on, the lo tizne haaretz. Let's see how Rashi handles that, right? So we translated it as so that the land doesn't fall to harlotry. I put a question mark there because I feel that it could be that what we're saying is that something is going to happen to the land, right? So let's see. Here we go, right? Im ata osechen, if you're going to do this, if you're going to, you know, uh, hand your unmarried daughter over for intercourse, etc., right? Haaretz mezane et perota. So you see, the zanot means to set aside, to turn aside. So Rashi has a different take on this. The land will remove her fruits, the asotan, b'makom acher, to in fact produce them in a different place. Interesting what that implies in terms of the relationship of the earth to its produce or to the fruit trees, v'lo ba'artzachem, but not in your land. So he's understanding Tiznei Haaretz as referring to its fruits. Of course, the purpose of intercourse is to produce fruit. So there's the connection there. V'chein hu omer, please excuse me. And so it says in Jeremiah 3, Vayimna'u revivim. In that particular case, it talks about, and the rains will be withheld. And the context must be that it's talking about the fact that there's a znut going on, that there's this immoral behavior going on in the land, and he talks about how the rains will be withheld. Going on. Et Shabtotai tishmeru, you shall guard my Sabbaths, umikdashi tirau, and fear my, or have respect, right, for my sanctuary. Ani Hashem, I the Lord. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at this interesting connection. So what is the conjunction, right? So, umikdashi tirau, and fear or respect my sanctuaries. So, quoting from the Gemara here in Yevamot, lo yikanes lo b'maklo. So this is saying that you need to treat that space with respect. You don't want to treat it as if it is simply another locale. And basically, in brachot, in tractate brachot, they talk about making a kapandrea out of the sanctuary. In other words, making it a shortcut. So here it says he should not enter the sanctuary, lo b'maklo, not with his staff, v'lo b'minalo, nor with his shoes, uva afundato, or with his money belt, uva avak she'al raglav, and with the dust that is on his feet. And notice that the Muslims are very, very careful, certainly, about not going into their place of worship with shoes on their feet. And I think there is some symbolism there. And in fact, there are other traditions that talk about the groundedness of your feet, the soles of your feet to the ground of the earth, and not having an interposition there. And that in a way it's unifying, right? Synthesizing yourself as a human being and part of the earth itself, that you're part of it. Going on and saying, in sort of interpolating the words of the verse itself. And despite the fact that I masirchem, that I am warning you, al hamikdash, regarding the sanctuary, et shabtotai tishmoro. You still have to guard my Sabbaths. And what does that mean? Ein binyan beit hamikdash. The construction of the temple does not, here we go, doche Shabbat. It does not set aside the Sabbath. Interesting, right? That as holy a work as constructing the sanctuary, it does not violate the Sabbath, that you still set it aside and use the Sabbath to devote simply to the service of God and to refrain from personal labor, but to try and focus on spiritual matters. So the other little piece I'm going to say is that we notice that many of these verses end with this seal, you might call it, I the Lord, I am the Lord, I am the Lord your God. And my recollection of that is that very often what that is referring to is some kind of situation where you might be able to do it privately and have people think that you're actually obeying the law when in fact you're not. And this is saying that, I'm the Lord because God is aware and conscious of every detail, every action that goes on in this world. Do not think that you are in private at any particular point, which is a basic overriding thought in terms of acting modestly. Going on. So we took care of everything that's up here as far as I can know. There we go. So let's keep going here. Al tifnu el ha'ovot, right? Do not turn to necromancy. Okay, ve'el hayid onim, and likewise, these are various kinds of spirits. Al tavat, again, necromancy, occult, those kind of practices, right? We've already had a reference to that kind of thing. Al tevakshu letom'ah bahem. Do not seek to cause yourselves to become impure through them, to defile yourself through them. And there we go. Ani Hashem Elokechem. I, the Lord, am your God. So, Al tifnu el ha'ovot. Do not turn to we'll just use I won't translate it for a moment, to the ovot. So, Ashara leva'al ov v'yidoni. So he's saying this is a prohibition to one who deals with these kinds of things, right? To a Baal ov or a yidoni. What's a Baal ov? He says, a Baal ov is ze pitos, looks like, or yeah, I think, just let me make sure I have this correctly. Yes, okay, pitom, right? Ze pitom, this is hamidamer beshichyo. This is like a medium, right? This is a medium who speaks from his armpit. He makes sounds from his armpit that presumably come from a deceased person. The Yidoni, and as for a Yidoni, machnis etzem chaya, he places the bone of an animal, sheshma yadua, whose name, and this looks like the name of it is a yadua, the tochpiv, into his mouth, the etzem medaber, and the bone itself is what speaks. So again, these kinds of practices to try and communicate with the dead. Al tefakshu, do not seek, lihiyot asukim bam, to occupy yourself in these kinds of practices. She'im ta'asku bam, because if in fact you do choose to practice these things, atem mitma'in lefanai, you are going to defile yourselves, cause yourselves to be impure before me. Va'ani meta'ev etchem, and I will be disgusted with you. Ani Hashem Elohechem, I, the Lord, am your God. De'u, know, et mi atem machlifim b'mi, know with whom you are exchanging with what, right? In other words, those part of course, I believe that our belief in this transcendent divine being is intimately connected to a sense of immortality, that human intelligence, human life, etc., is so deep, etc., that in this particular lifetime we have certain things to achieve, but part of what we want to try and achieve is the ability to live beyond the grave, and doing these kinds of practices which try to, in a way, shortchange this, right? Then undermine it. They undermine it. Go ahead, going on. Mipnei seva, before the aged, right? Someone who's aged, takum, you shall rise. Vahadarta pnei zaken, and you shall honor the presence of a elderly person. Vayaretem Elohecha, and you shall fear your God. Ani Hashem, I am the Lord. So let's take a look. There's some things that don't necessarily seem to be directly connected, and so we're going to have to try and connect these pieces. Right. Here we go. Mipnei seva, before the, I would say, before age, or perhaps the aged in years, takum, you shall rise. So this is in the Sifra and in the Tractate Kiddushin, Yachol Zaken Ashmai. So I believe it's referring to someone who is elderly, but doesn't act properly. This person acts in a foolish kind of way, right? Talmud Lomar Zaken. So for this reason, scripture teaches the word Zaken. Ein Zaken. So he understands that someone who is a Zaken, an elder, right? An elder, Ela Shekana Chochma, someone who has achieved wisdom. So part of it isn't just a matter of age alone. It also is that you're someone who clearly has experienced life and has learned the lessons of life and achieved a level of wisdom. And despite the fact that physically you may not have the capacity of a younger person, nevertheless, a younger person needs to show respect for that ability that you had to use your years to achieve wisdom. So Vahadarta, right? You shall honor, or remember, we talk about beautify, right? Hidur mitzvah, that is, it's the same root, beautifying a mitzvah. Pnei zaken, the presence of a elderly person, a zaken. Eze hud hadur. So again, Rashi is defining what do we mean by hidur, right? Or beautifying, quote, quote. Lo yeshev bimkomo, you shouldn't sit in his place. If he has a place where he normally sits, you don't go and sit there. In a way, it's understood as being a disrespectful act. Velo yistor et dvarav, and you shouldn't interrupt his words or contradict him, right? Yacho ya'atzim einav, it's possible that you may close your eyes. In other words, pretend kamosha lo ra'ahu, as if he has not seen this elderly person, this wise aged person. L'chach nemar, and for this reason it states, but you should fear your God. Shaharei devar zeh masur l'libo. Why? Because this particular kind of behavior is in your heart. In other words, it can be done in a private kind of way. It takes a conscious effort on your part to behave in this way, right? Shel osehu. In other words, it depends on the heart of the one who's practicing it, who does these things, who honors an elderly person. She'ein makir bo, okay, so that because he does not, ella who, okay, because there is no one who recognizes him except who. So we'll try and understand what this is saying, okay? I think what this is saying is that no one else knows what's going on in the heart of this particular individual, or of the one who's supposed to act in this way, elahu, except for himself. V'chol davar hamasur lelev, and he says, and anything that is relegated to the heart, in other words, anything that a person practices from a private position, right, in a very individual position where no one else necessarily knows what's in his heart, right? Because nobody knows what you're feeling or what you're thinking necessarily. And here's the point I was making before. Ne'emar bo v'yareta melohecha. You should fear your God, because God knows what's going on in your heart. But mitzvahs that are undetectable, in a sense, that others would not know whether you're practicing them or not, those have these particular words added to them. Let's go on. Let's see, we can take one more. Right, so this is, we're going on to a new a new section here, a new aliyah. V'chei yagur itcha ger. And in the case of a ger, right, a stranger, a proselyte, a non-Jew, a non-Israelite, lives with you. Should this person sojourn with you, should live with you, v'artzachem, in your land, lo tonu oto. You should not take advantage of him. You shouldn't subject him to to bad behavior, to taking advantage of him, essentially is what it means. Okay, so Lord Tonu, you should not abuse him. Onaat dvarim lo tomarlo, meaning using words of dvarim, words, lo tom dvarim, is period. That's what this is referring to. When it says, do not take advantage of him or abuse him, it's talking about abusing him with your speech. He's going to say, Lo tomar lo emesh hayita oved avodat elalim. You shouldn't say to him, well, yesterday you were an idolater. V'achshav ata ba lilmod Torah. And today you have the impertinence, so to speak, to come to study Torah, shenitna mipi hagvura, which was given directly from the great power from God, in other words. So in other words, to remind him of his previous status, this is something from the Torah that one is forbidden to do. That if someone comes from outside the Jewish family and comes to choose, and here it just simply says ger. Today we understand the word ger. This is based on a rabbinic interpretation, that it refers to a proselyte, to someone who converts to Judaism. That's how we understand it, and that's how this halacha is understood today, that you shouldn't do it. But here it's basically saying if someone who's of non-Jewish origins doesn't necessarily say that the person is taken on formally Judaism. This is discussed elsewhere in the Talmud, because there are different kinds of gerim. There's a ger who essentially may still continue to eat non-kosher food, but nevertheless rejects the idea of any God other than Eloheinu Bashamayim, than our God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All right, that's one kind. And then there's, of course, one who totally takes on all the mitzvot. But regardless, you don't insult. You don't insult a person, despite the fact that they may have come and worshipped idols prior to this time. And with this, I'd like to stop right here. I'll place in here. And with God's help, we will start right here tomorrow.
Have a good day.
You too. Thanks, Judith.
Thank you.
Okay.